It started with an inheritance. My great-uncle James had passed away suddenly, leaving his sprawling property in rural Vermont to my family. The house, known locally as Stillwater, had been in the family for generations but had fallen into disrepair after years of neglect. My parents were excited about the idea of restoring it, but their busy schedules meant they couldn't visit for several months. That left me, a college student on summer break, to check it out and stay there until contractors could assess the work needed. The idea of spending a few weeks alone in a massive, decaying mansion didn't exactly thrill me, but I told myself it would be an adventure. When I arrived, I immediately regretted agreeing to this. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by dense woods. Its paint was peeling, the shutters hung crookedly, and several windows were cracked. Even in broad daylight, it exuded an unsettling air. Still, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old house. I unloaded my things, set up camp in one of the least dusty rooms, and tried to settle in. For the first night, I convinced myself that everything would be fine. The trouble began on the second night. I'd spent most of the day exploring the house, opening doors to find forgotten furniture draped in sheets, dusty family portraits, and creaky staircases that led to nowhere. The house was a maze, with hallways that seemed to stretch longer than the house itself, and rooms I couldn't remember passing on the way in. By evening, I felt completely disoriented. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard the first sound, a faint creaking coming from the second floor. I froze, listening intently. The sound was rhythmic, like footsteps moving slowly across the floorboards above me. My rational brain tried to explain it away. The house was old, and old houses creak. But these weren't random groans of wood contracting. They were deliberate, measured steps. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured upstairs. The hallway was dim, lit only by the fading sunlight streaming through the grimy windows. I checked each room, shining my light into the corners and under the furniture. There was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had imagined the footsteps. Maybe I'd been overtired from the drive and the stress of being in an unfamiliar place. Determined to push through my unease, I decided to clean up the house a bit, hoping that making it more livable would make me feel more at home. While dusting one of the bedrooms, I noticed something odd. A small wooden door, barely 3 feet tall, was embedded into the far wall. It was painted the same color as the walls, making it almost invisible. I wouldn't have noticed it if the sunlight hadn't caught the faint outline of its edges. Curious, I tried the handle, but it was locked. A strange sense of unease crept over me as I stared at the door. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong there. I made a mental note to ask my parents about it later, then moved on to another room. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. They moved back and forth above me, stopping occasionally as if whoever, or whatever, was up there was listening. I lay in bed, clutching my phone, debating whether to call someone. But who would I call? The police? What would I even say? I think my great-uncle's house is haunted? At around 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. Just as I was starting to relax, there was a loud thud right outside my bedroom door. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The sound had been so loud, so close, that I couldn't dismiss it as the house settling. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the door. My hand shook as I turned the knob and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. The next morning, I called my parents, trying to keep my voice steady as I recounted the previous night's events. My mom brushed it off, saying I was probably just spooked from being alone in such an old house. My dad joked that maybe I'd inherited Uncle James' ghost along with the property. Their lack of concern only frustrated me, but I resolved to stay. I wasn't going to let an old house get the better of me. Later that day, while exploring the basement, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates was another small door, identical to the one upstairs. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one wasn't locked. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob, before finally mustering the courage to open it. Inside was a narrow staircase spiraling downward. A damp, Musty smell wafted up from the darkness. I shone my flashlight down the steps, but the beam couldn't reach the bottom. The logical part of me screamed to shut the door and forget I'd ever found it, but curiosity pushed me forward. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of mildew became almost overpowering. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with what appeared to be jars of murky liquid. In the center of the room was a wooden table, and on it lay an open book. The book was filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, scrawled in a language I couldn't read. Diagrams of strange symbols and drawings of distorted, humanoid figures filled the pages. My hands trembled as I flipped through it, a growing sense of dread washing over me. I had seen enough. I slammed the book shut and hurried back up the stairs, leaving the door ajar in my haste. That night, everything came to a head. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the basement door creaking open. My heart pounded as I strained to hear what came next. The footsteps that followed weren't slow and deliberate like before. They were quick, almost frantic, moving through the house with purpose. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was in the house. As I waited for the police to arrive, I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I could hear faint breathing on the other side. The doorknob rattled. I backed away, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone. The operator was still speaking, asking me to stay calm and stay on the line, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. Suddenly, the rattling stopped, and the house fell silent. Minutes later, I saw flashing red and blue lights outside the window. The police found no one in the house, but the basement door was wide open. They assured me the house was empty, but their faces betrayed their confusion. I left Stillwater the next morning. My parents were upset that I abandoned the house, but I didn't care. I told them everything, but they remained skeptical. Contractors eventually went to inspect the property and reported finding nothing unusual. A few months later, I received a package from my parents. Inside was the book I'd found in the basement, along with a note that simply read, "We thought you might want this for your records." I burned it that same night. To this day, I can't explain what happened in Stillwater. I've done everything I can to forget about it, but sometimes, late at night, I dream about the door in the basement, and in those dreams, it's always open, waiting for me to come back. It happened 2 summers ago, during what was supposed to be a carefree week of solitude. My parents had gone on a cruise to celebrate their anniversary, leaving me to look after the house. At 24, I was no stranger to being alone, and our suburban neighborhood was as uneventful as they came. Still, I remember thinking how quiet the house felt without them. Eerily quiet. The first few days passed without incident. I worked from home during the day, cooked easy meals in the evening, and watched mindless TV shows until I felt tired enough to sleep. On the third night, though, the strange occurrences began. I was in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. Our kitchen window faced the backyard, which was enclosed by a tall wooden fence. The view was mostly unremarkable. Patchy grass, the neighbor's shed visible over the fence, and the dim glow of the motion sensor light attached to our garage. But as I looked out the window that night, I noticed something strange. The garage light had flickered on, even though nothing appeared to be moving outside. I stared into the yard, my hands still submerged in soapy water, waiting for something, anything, to explain the sudden activation. The seconds stretched on, but the yard remained still. Then, as if on cue, the light turned off. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to a bird or maybe even a gust of wind triggering the sensor. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the back door before heading upstairs to my bedroom, a habit I'd never been strict about until that night. The unease followed me into my dreams. I woke up around 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, with the distinct memory of a nightmare where someone was standing over my bed, watching me sleep. I turned on my bedside lamp and looked around the room, my heart pounding. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't calm down. I grabbed my phone, scrolling mindlessly until exhaustion pulled me back under. The next morning, I found the backyard gate standing wide open. Our gate was heavy and latched securely from the inside. There was no way it could have been blown open by the wind. I told myself I must have forgotten to latch it the last time I was outside. That explanation felt flimsy, but it was better than entertaining the alternative, that someone had been in our yard while I was asleep. That evening, as I locked the doors and checked the windows, I caught myself glancing into the backyard again. The garage light flickered on, and this time, I saw it. A man stood in the yard, just barely visible in the weak glow of the motion light. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured most of his face. He wasn't moving, wasn't even looking in my direction, just standing there, like a statue. I froze. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a neighbor? A burglar casing the house? A prank? My fingers fumbled for my phone, but by the time I raised it to snap a picture, the light flickered off, plunging the yard into darkness. When I turned the porch light on and scanned the yard, he was gone. The police arrived within 10 minutes after I called them. I explained what I'd seen, though I could tell from the officer's expression that he thought I was overreacting. He and his partner searched the yard, checked the gate, and even shone their flashlights into the neighboring yards. They found no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the soft grass, and no evidence that anyone had been there at all. "It's probably just a kid messing around," one of the officers said as they prepared to leave. "Keep your doors locked and call us if you see anything else." Their dismissive tone irritated me, but I tried to convince myself they were right. Maybe it was just a stupid prank. Maybe the man wasn't even real, just a trick of the shadows and my tired mind. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every shift of the wind against the windows like a whisper of something sinister. I left the lights on in the hallway and locked my bedroom door, clutching my phone under the blankets like a lifeline. At around 2 a.m., I heard a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakably coming from the direction of the backyard. I sat up in bed, my pulse thundering in my ears. Gathering my courage, I crept to the window and peeked out through the blinds. He was there again, standing closer this time, near the edge of the patio, directly beneath my window. The motion light didn't activate this time, leaving him shrouded in shadow, but I could see the faint glint of his eyes as he tilted his head up to look at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a pile of clothes on the floor. My first instinct was to call the police again, but a terrifying thought stopped me. What if he could hear me? My phone's ringer, my whispered words, they could all give me away. I decided to wait, hoping he'd leave like last time. Minutes stretched into an eternity. When I finally mustered the courage to peek through the blinds again, he was gone. The relief was short-lived, though, as I noticed something chilling. The motion light above the garage was flickering again. Only this time, it wasn't turning off completely. It was as if someone were standing just outside its range, triggering it repeatedly. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He was still there, lurking just out of sight. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my car keys and slipped out of the house, keeping the lights off and my movements as quiet as possible. As I reversed out of the driveway, I scanned the yard one last time. The light had stopped flickering, and the yard was empty. I spent the night at a friend's house, explaining the situation to her in hushed, panicked tones. She let me crash on her couch, but sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I returned home with my friend, hoping the daylight would make me feel braver. We walked through the house together, checking every room and corner. Everything seemed normal, until we reached the backyard. The words, "I see you," were carved into the wooden fence. I moved out of my parents' house within a month, but the memory of that week still haunts me. I never found out who the man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just trying to scare me. Or maybe, in some twisted way, he was watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. All I know is that I'll never feel completely safe home alone again. It was mid-January, and the temperature outside had dipped well below freezing. I was house-sitting for my aunt while she vacationed in Florida. She owned a cozy cabin upstate, tucked away in a quiet woodland area. I'd stayed there before, so it didn't seem like a big deal when she asked me to take care of it for a week. It was just me, the creaking floorboards, and the occasional howl of wind outside. The first couple of days passed uneventfully. I'd spend my mornings hiking nearby trails and my evenings curled up with a book. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, it felt like a nice break from the noise of my usual life. That changed on the third night. I was halfway through a movie, the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls, when I thought I heard something outside. At first, I dismissed it as wind rattling the shutters or maybe a deer stumbling through the brush. But then it happened again. A distinct, deliberate knock on the back door. I froze, the remote slipping from my fingers onto the couch. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest, and the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. My aunt had specifically told me that visitors were rare, especially in the dead of winter. The knock came again, louder this time. I got up slowly, grabbing the iron poker from the fireplace. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed toward the back door. Through the frosted glass, I couldn't see anything, just the dark outline of trees illuminated by the porch light. Summoning whatever courage I had, I unlocked the door and swung it open. No one was there. The wind immediately bit at my skin, and the cold air sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The snow-covered ground was pristine, untouched by footprints. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there moments before. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and went to bed earlier than usual, my nerves on edge. The next night, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I decided to distract myself by calling my boyfriend, Matt, and telling him about the strange knocking. He laughed, teasing me about my overactive imagination. His easygoing attitude helped, and by the time we hung up, I felt a little better. That is, until the power went out. The sudden plunge into darkness was jarring. The cabin was now pitch black except for the faint glow of the fireplace. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to find my way to the kitchen, where I kept a stash of candles and matches. As I lit the first candle, I heard it again. This time, tapping on the window by the sink. The light from the candle cast eerie, shifting shadows, but I forced myself to move toward the window. I peered out into the darkness, but again, there was nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the trees swaying in the icy wind. I couldn't take it anymore. I called Matt back, my voice shaking as I begged him to drive up and stay the night. He reluctantly agreed, saying he'd leave as soon as he packed a bag. The thought of having him here was the only thing keeping me sane. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, when I realized I'd left my phone in the kitchen. As I got up to retrieve it, I heard the unmistakable creak of a floorboard above me. My blood ran cold. The cabin was one story. I froze in place, listening. There it was again, a deliberate, heavy step coming from the attic. My aunt never mentioned an attic. In fact, I didn't even remember seeing an entrance to one. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace again, my hands trembling. Slowly, I moved toward the hallway, my flashlight cutting through the dark. That's when I saw it. A small hatch in the ceiling, partially obscured by shadows. The creaking continued, growing louder and more deliberate. Something, or someone, was definitely up there. I didn't wait to find out who. I bolted back to the living room, grabbed my keys, and ran out the front door to my car. The bitter cold didn't even register as I fumbled to unlock the door. I started the engine and sped down the winding road, my tires crunching over ice and snow. Matt arrived at the cabin an hour later. By then, I was parked in a gas station parking lot, trying to explain what had happened. He didn't seem to take me seriously, but agreed to go back to the cabin with me to check things out. When we arrived, everything seemed normal. No signs of forced entry, no strange noises. He even climbed up to the attic hatch using a stepladder we found in the closet. It was empty. The next morning, I was packing my things when Matt called me over to the living room. He was holding a folded piece of paper that had been wedged under the couch. My stomach churned as I read the single line written on it. "You looked so peaceful sleeping." I never went back to that cabin again.